Hello, and welcome back to Buggles-Kelly Station. "2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the Railway series, the books by the Reverend Awdry about Thomas the Tank Engine and friends. It's because of these books, and the model series that followed, that I'm a model maker today. For the anniversary, I've decided to build a diorama of an iconic Railway series building, Mrs. Kyndley's cottage. Because I'll be displaying the diorama at model shows, I need it to be able to fit into a small flat box, and so I'll be building it on an A4 size board of 3mm ply. This means I'll need to work in a smaller scale than usual, opting to 1:148 scale or 2mm to the foot, British N gauge. This is handy because I've already got an N gauge Thomas. I braced the underside of the board with 1cm strip wood and glued this in place and secured with small nails. The centrepiece of the diorama is of course Mrs. Kyndley's cottage. I designed the building in Tinkercad, following Illustrations by Reginald Dalby for guidance, basing the house on the books rather than the TV series version. In the later books, which were illustrated by Clive Spong, the right hand side of the house is shown, but for some reason he's added a window directly where the chimney breast would be, so I've decided to brick this up on the model, suggesting that the second chimney may have been added later. The building was then printed in resin and sprayed with a white acrylic primer. When dry, I painted the thatch roof with an earth brown and dry brushed a lighter brown shade over the top. I'm painting two buildings at once here, as I'll display a 00 gauge or 1:76 scale model alongside the diorama at shows, just as a way to show off more detail. The wooden porch is painted dark brown, and the doors are apple green. The rear of the house isn't shown in any of the illustrations, so I've been able to use some creative license to add a rear brick extension and a buttress, as if the house is falling down at the back. The tiles are painted with a rust colour, and the drain pipes and ironwork are black. The final stage is to add a watered down green to represent mould and damp. It is an old cottage after all. And then afterwards, I spray the models with a matte varnish to reduce any shine. If you want to add Mrs. Kyndley's cottage to your model railway or diorama, these are now available to order at buggleskellystation.com. If you take any advice from this video, it's never throw away IKEA packaging. This thick card packing material forms the basis of all of my dioramas, as it's strong and it's lightweight, and it's much less messy to work with than foam. I use Mod Podge to stick the card down to the board. The edges of the banks were made using formers of mounting board card, which were again held in place with Mod Podge. I then used mounting board card to surround the diorama. This was held together to dry with elastic bands overnight. I wanted the cottage to sit on fairly flat ground, so I marked out where it would sit and I attached this to the landform. To build up the embankments, I used scrunched up newspaper and held this in place with matte parcel tape. This is quite a good way to work if you need to adjust anything, as it can be easily ripped away later. The illustrations show rock faces alongside the track, so I've decided to add these opposite the cottage. I used Woodland Scenics rock bolts and filled them with Herculite 2 which is basically a tougher alternative to plaster of Paris. As it's a messy job, I made lots of rocks at once as they'll be used for my main layout build too. The rocks were then placed where I needed them and snapped to fit the shapes required. They were stuck in place using grab adhesive. The next stage is the messiest, covering the entire diorama with sculptor mould, which is a plaster and paper mix which you mix with water. This took 24 hours to dry solid. It could then be sanded down. Next, I used cheap artist acrylics to mix up a mixture of burnt sienna and black, and then I painted everything in this dark brown colour. At this stage, I stuck the track down with grab adhesive, and when dry, I sprayed over it all with an earth brown acrylic spray. The road at the back got a light grey coat, which I also used for the basis of the rock faces. I built up the rock colours using a watered down brick red, sand, dark grey and green. The rocks got a black wash to fill in all the crevices, and then when dry, they were dry brushed with more light grey to bring out the highlights. The original story takes place on a rainy day, so I wanted to include some puddles, which is something I love to add but I rarely see on model railways. Making puddles is quite a bit easier than you might think. I started with an acetate sheet. I sprayed one side of the acetate with an earth brown acrylic and let it dry. When fully dry, I turned the sheet over to reveal a shiny earth brown puddle. These were then placed in different locations, including by the cottage and on the track bed. I then mixed up some terracotta milliput, which I pressed around the edges of the acetate. It's a tiny detail, but when the light catches the puddles, it adds just another level of realism. I also used the milliput to build up the landslip, which has covered the tracks just around the bend. I added to this some more plaster rock shards and allowed the milliput to dry solid. I was kindly sent a selection of samples from True to Scale, which are the new Scenics arm of specialist aggregates. They produce ballast and other aggregates in the correct dimensions for each scale. This isn't sponsored, by the way, but I must say that I am really impressed with how the ballast looks so fine when you see it up against the N-gauge track. I chose a mid-grey ballast and I added this using a teaspoon. I then sprayed the track with isopropyl alcohol and soaked the area with scenic cement, which is a Woodland Scenics product, but it's basically 50-50 Mod Podge and water, with a drop of washing up liquid to break up the surface tension. This was then left to dry overnight. To make the path around the house, I used Universal Ground Texture by True to Scale, which has an even finer grain than the Ballast. I then added neat Mod Podge matte to all the areas where dirt might be visible, namely to the edges of the fields and the vegetable patch in the garden. For the dirt, I used Dark Brown Scatter by Tom's Modelling Corner. I applied it to the landslip and to all of the exposed earth areas. I've added a muddy field entrance here, suggesting this might be where Terence the tractor likes to visit Mrs. Kyndley. The next stage instantly transforms any diorama. I've chosen Woodland Scenics 2mm medium green as the base layer, and this gets applied wherever I've added neat Mod Podge. It looks very bright at this stage, but I've added some variation by spraying Stronghold hairspray and then adding patches of Warworld Scenics patchy grass. As the banks are quite steep, I brush the grass upright so it doesn't look like it's sticking out at an angle. As I normally model in 4mm, I don't have much in the way of fencing for 1:148 scale, but I found this picket style fence which should pass when cut down to a few millimetres high. This laser cut post and wire fence is by Commodore Studio. It's a tiny little kit which is really quite fiddly if you have fat fingers, but the results are quite effective. First, I painted the fence post dark brown and added some green colour to represent algae. The laser cutting process burns the edge of the posts anyway, so you only need to paint the front and the back. Using a pin, I pushed holes into the sculptor mould and worked my way along inserting the posts with a dab of super glue. I did contemplate doing this before adding the static grass, but I thought it might stick to the wires, so I've decided to go this way around instead, which I think has worked. The wire was then passed along the bottom row, looped back on itself, and repeated in the other direction until all 5 wires are added. This actually took me nearly an hour, and I accidentally tangled up the remaining wire, which took another hour to try and detangle before I gave up and cut it in half, but I was able to rescue just enough to finish the fences. The field gate is by Pico. It's just a way that Terence can get in and out of the field if he wants to. Although it's true to the illustration, I didn't like how bare the scene looked with just fences, so I've added some hedgerows alongside too. These are made from rubberised horsehair. It's cut up into strips and stuck down on tape. I then brushed them with Mod Podge and sprinkled on leaf scatters, which were made by Tree Mendus. The hedges were glued in place, and extra scatters, which were made by Woodland Scenics and Tree Mendus, were added to blend them together. On the vegetable patch, I painted rows of Mod Podge and then scattered on some leaves, which stuck to the glue. I then placed individual vegetables made from Woodland Scenics foliage along the rows. I'm not sure what vegetables they're supposed to be, I'm more of a cheese man, but I think they look about right. These flowers by Primo Models are a bit overscale for 2mm, so I trimmed them down and attached them in the front garden with Mod Podge. When I was happy with everything, I applied scenic glue over all of the loose scenery using a pipette. When this had dried, I painted the edges of the diorama black. I then made a tiny red dressing gown out of painted paper, and I superglued it into the upstairs bedroom window. The diorama is now complete. Hanging, flapping and bedraggled from a window of the cottage was something that looked like a large red flag. "Mrs. Kyndley needs help, I expect," said the driver, and put on the brakes. Thomas gently stopped. The diorama will be on display at all of our upcoming events, including Model World Live, which is this weekend, at the NEC in Birmingham. And don't forget, if you want to add Mrs. Kyndley's cottage to your model railway or diorama, these are now available to order at buggleskellystation.com. Thank you for watching, and happy 80th anniversary to the Railway series.